Part 2, the shoulder muscles. We have a lot of them, a lot of motions in the shoulder, so we have to have a lot of muscles to do those motions. So, the downward retractors of the scapula, also known as just retractors of the scapula, but there is a slight downward motion with them. Scapular retraction is often referred to as pinching your shoulder blades together. It's linked to upper extremity movements such as rowing or pulling. Important movements, right? The primary scapular retractors are the rhomboids, which we talked about as scapular elevators. The middle trapezius, it has that direct line of pull for scapular retraction. And the other two, the upper and lower trapezius, also help. So we talked about upper and lower trapezius, and now we'll define the middle. So the middle trapezius is a triangular muscle. It has the sort of the smallest attachment of any of the trapezius muscles. It's the spinous processes of C7 to T5 and the medial aspect of the acromion process for the insertion. And you can see it has that direct horizontal line of pull for scapular retraction. And the spinal accessory nerve, cranial nerve 11, is also its innervation, just like the upper and lower trapezius. So all three parts of the trapezius are synergists for retraction. The upper and lower are antagonists of one another for elevation and depression, and they're also antagonists for one another for upward and downward rotation. So it's interesting how the same muscles can cooperate on some things and be antagonists on other things. So very interesting group of muscles. Now we're going to talk more about things that actually move the humerus, the glenohumeral joint. We were getting some humeral motion with some of the other muscles we talked about, either coincidentally with other motions or directly, like through the latissimus dorsi. So the abductors are Superspinatus and the anterior and middle deltoids. Those are our major abductors. The flexors include the anterior deltoid, the clavicular head of the PEC Major, the coracobrachialis maybe, and the biceps brachii definitely. So we'll talk about each one of those. The Superspinatus, it does shoulder abduction as its primary motion. We're going to find out later, or you probably already know, that it is also a major player in the rotator cuff group. It lies under the coracoacromial arch. It's deep to the trapezius and the deltoid. You can palpate it through the trapezius, and the way to find it is finding that scapular spine, because it lives in the supraspinous fossa of the scapula. So the scapular spine is a great landmark for finding the supraspinous fossa. You have to go through some other muscles to get to it, but you can palpate the supraspinatus. So it originates on the supraspinous fossa. It dives underneath the subacromial arch, or the coracoacromial arch, to the superior facet of the greater tubercle. So it has that great line of pull for abduction of the glenohumeral joint, of the humerus. And it gets the suprascapular nerve. Doesn't that make sense, that the supraspinatus gets the suprascapular nerve? Okay, the nerves are not as easy as the legs, but they are making sense. The anterior deltoid, it assists with the middle deltoid in abduction. It also does flexion, medial rotation, and horizontal adduction. So that's a busy little muscle right there. The deltoid itself, as its name implies, is a triangular muscle, and each section of it is a little triangular part in and of itself. So the anterior originates on the anterior lateral third of the clavicle, and it inserts with the other three parts on the deltoid tuberosity. And it gets the axillary nerve. So you can think of axillary nerve as the axilla or the armpit. The deltoid is close to the armpit. It gets the axillary nerve. Maybe that helps. Okay. But it's definitely a major player in flexion of the humerus and medial rotation, and then it assists the middle with abduction. So the middle is its main job is abduction. It has a straight line of pull for abduction, just like the supraspinatus has. So those guys are kind of the major players in glenohumeral abduction. It has what we call the inchworm effect. So there's a certain point in abduction where the middle deltoid is as short as it's going to be. So how do we restore contractile potential so we can cross over some more actin and myosins and get some more elevation? The way we do it, the scapula rotates up. Excuse me. It moves the acromion away from the insertion and restores the contractile potential. So it does it inch by inch. That's why they call it the inchworm effect. So the inchworm effect is closely related to scapulohumeral rhythm. So the acromion has to move out of the way in order for the humerus to do its job. So the effect of the acromion moving out of the way on the middle deltoid is it keeps moving its origin farther away from its insertion and restoring contractile potential. So it's pretty cool that it works out that way. The middle deltoid also, its origin is on the superior lateral surface of the acromion, which is why that works. And its insertion is also on the deltoid tuberosity. Abduction is its reason for living. And it also gets the axillary nerve, just like the anterior deltoid. So, adductors and extensors. So, adduction, we abducted the humerus, now we have to adduct it. So the adductors are the Latissimus Dorsi, the Teres Major, and the Pectoralis Major. So the Teres Major is the Latissimus Dorsi's little helper. Remember how I said a lot of muscles have little helpers? There you go. It has a similar line of pull to Latissimus Dorsi. It's just smaller, and it does the same thing. And we'll talk about each one of them. The extensors are the Latissimus Dorsi, the Teres Major, the PEC Major, the posterior deltoid, and the long head of the triceps. So we'll talk about each of those individually. So the Latissimus Dorsi we already talked about. Let me get back to Latissimus Dorsi. I guess I could have put another Latissimus Dorsi slide in here, but I didn't. Okay, anyway, we know the Latissimus Dorsi has the broad attachment all along the spinous processes of the thoracic and lumbar spine. And the narrow insertion on the floor of the bicipital groove. So it gives us that line of pull for adduction because it brings the arm back down to anatomical position. It gives us a great line of pull for extension, pulling the humerus posteriorly. And it also gives us a line of pull for internal rotation, which we'll talk about, medial rotation. So the PEC Major, it has two heads. It has the clavicular head, which strangely enough attaches to the clavicle, and the sternal head, which attaches to the sternum. No surprises here. It's our most superficial anterior muscle, and it forms the anterior axillary fold, also known as the front of your armpit. So the clavicular portion, its origin is on the medial third of the clavicle, and its insertion, shared with the sternal portion, is the crest of the greater tubercle of the humerus. So wow, look at that line of pull. That gives you a line of pull for flexion to 90 degrees. Once you get past 90 degrees, you don't have a line of pull for flexion. So we'll look at it in the lab, and you'll see that that's true. medial rotation because it's pulling that greater tubercle medially, and horizontal adduction. So it has like the queen of lines of pull for horizontal adduction. It gets the lateral and medial pectoral nerve just like the PEC Minor. So that's easy to remember. The sternal portion of the PEC Major, it goes from the lateral manubrium and sternum and the costal cartilage of the first 6 ribs. So it's got that broad origin and the small insertion. It's a triangular muscle. And it shares the insertion with the other head, the crest of the greater tubercle of the humerus. So because of its line of pull, the more downward facing fibers, the ones that go from inferior to superior, it can extend the shoulder to 90 degrees. It can adduct the shoulder and do medial rotation. So the sternal head and the clavicular head have different lines of pull. That's why they're different. They have different fiber directions. So just like we saw with the gluteus medius, its anterior fibers could do some things. Its posterior fibers and medial fibers could do some things. It gives it a little more flexibility in motion, things it can do. And it gets the lateral medial pectoral nerve just like the PEC Minor and the clavicular head. The Teres Major, it's the last little helper, same movement, just smaller. It attaches on the inferior angle of the scapula and the crest of the lesser tubercle, medial to the Latissimus Dorsi attachment. And it gets extension. It does extension, adduction, and medial rotation of the humerus. It gets the lower subscapular nerve, and that makes sense. Subscapular, lower. It's low on the scapula. So one way that people have for remembering the muscles that attach onto the greater tubercle and lesser tubercle and the bicipital groove, which are the Teres Major, PEC Major, and Latissimus Dorsi. The Teres Major is medial, the Latissimus Dorsi is in the middle between the two, and the PEC Major is lateral. I've heard it called, it's a lady, the Latissimus Dorsi, between 2 majors, Teres Major and PEC Major. So the Latissimus Dorsi is on the bicipital groove, the Teres Major is on the lesser tubercle, and the PEC Major is on the greater tubercle. So lady between 2 majors. I don't know if that helps you or not. Teres Major. Okay. The rotator cuff, it's a group of 4 muscles that surround the humeral head anteriorly, superiorly, and posteriorly. And they stabilize the humeral head on the glenoid fossa. They function as dynamic stabilizers for the glenohumeral joint. So it's the Superspinatus, Infraspinatus, Teres Minor, and Subscapularis. So we already talked about the Superspinatus, and it has that line of pull for abduction. It also pulls the head of the humerus right into the glenoid fossa as it's abducting. Makes sense? Okay, now we're going to talk about the Infraspinatus, Teres Minor, and Subscapularis and see how they fit in that group. So Infraspinatus is mostly superficial, and it lies just below the spine of the scapula in, surprise, surprise, the infraspinous fossa of the scapula. Okay, that is no surprise. Infraspinatus, infraspinous fossa. It can also be called the infraspinatus fossa if you want to be super simple. I mean, that belongs on stupid questions on Jeopardy, right? Or stupid answers. I don't know, I haven't seen Jeopardy in a while. So, origin is the infraspinous fossa of the scapula. Insertion is the middle facet of the greater tubercle of the humerus. If you just say greater tubercle of the humerus, I will be perfectly happy with that. It has that line of pull for lateral rotation. So it pulls the greater tubercle posteriorly, and you get lateral rotation. It also has that sort of inferior medial line of pull, pulling the head of the humerus in and down to the glenoid fossa. That's part of its rotator cuff job. So it does lateral rotation. It functions the rotator cuff, and lateral rotation is its other job. It has 2 full-time jobs. it gets the suprascapular nerve just like the Superspinatus. The Teres Minor is the Infraspinatus' little helper. So it lives with it right there in the infraspinous fossa, the posterior lateral border of the scapula near the inferior angle, and it's on the lower facet of the greater tubercle. So it makes up the rest of the posterior aspect. So the Superspinatus surrounds the head of the humerus superiorly. The Infraspinatus and Teres Minor surround it posteriorly. Teres Minor, just like the Infraspinatus, does lateral rotation. It's closer to the armpit, though, so it gets the axillary nerve, as does the Teres Major. The Subscapularis is on the anterior surface of the scapula. So it's the subscapular fossa of the scapula, and it goes out to the lesser tubercle of the humerus. So it's the one that stabilizes, that surrounds the head of the humerus anteriorly. It does medial rotation, and it does its job pulling inferiorly and sucking the head of the humerus into the glenoid fossa. And it gets the upper subscapular nerve. So the subscapularis gets the subscapular nerve. That makes sense, right? Well, in the function section, we will talk about more about how the rotator cuff works. So, internal and external rotators, a lot of the muscles we've talked about have the function of internal and external rotation. And we just have to have that line of pull that goes from medial to lateral, either anteriorly or posteriorly. So if the muscle is an anterior muscle and it goes from medial to lateral, it's going to do internal rotation. If it's a posterior muscle and it goes from medial to lateral, it's going to do external rotation. The ones that cross over from posterior to anterior, like the Teres Major and the Latissimus Dorsi, do internal rotation. So when you're in the lab, get out some rubber bands, or get out some rubber bands right now and try that out and see how it works. So internal rotators are Teres Major, PEC Major, Subscap, Latissimus Dorsi, and Anterior Deltoid. External rotators are Teres Minor, Infraspinatus, and Posterior Deltoid. So a lot of whether it's going to be internal or external depends on where it attaches.